Someone is being kind to you right now. Too kind. They remember your birthday after meeting you once. They agree with almost everything you say. They tell you that you are exactly the kind of person they've been looking for. It feels wonderful. It is also a technique with a name. You have probably never thought about how a cult actually begins. Not with chanting, not with robes, not with anything you'd recognize as strange. It begins with attention. Focused, relentless, flattering attention, aimed directly at whatever you happen to be missing that week. Your brain did not evolve to resist this. It evolved to crave it. Think about what belonging meant for most of human history. For your ancestors, being cast out of the group was not an inconvenience. It was often a death sentence. No group meant no shared food, no protection from predators, no one to notice if you didn't come back from a hunt. So your brain built a deep, automatic reward system around social acceptance. When someone signals that you belong, your nervous system treats it almost like finding water in a desert. Cult recruiters, whether they know the psychology behind it or not, have discovered how to trigger that exact response, on command, in strangers. This is not a story about weak-minded people falling for an obvious con. Researchers who study this have found something far less comfortable. The people most likely to join high-control groups are often intelligent, socially capable, and going through a completely ordinary transition. A move to a new city, a breakup, the first lonely semester of college, a death in the family, not damaged people, transitional people. That distinction matters enormously because it means almost anyone at the right moment is reachable. Picture the first meeting. It rarely looks like a meeting at all. It might be a conversation at a bookstore, an invitation to a free seminar on stress management, a friendly stranger on campus asking for 5 minutes of your opinion. Cult researchers call this the love bombing phase, and it is astonishingly consistent across groups that otherwise have nothing in common. You are seen, you are heard, you are told in 100 small ways that you matter more here than you did anywhere else. Notice what this does to your internal defenses. Suspicion requires energy. Warmth disarms it. You did not agree to lower your guard. Your guard simply had no reason to stay up. The psychologist Robert Cialdini spent decades studying why people say yes to things they would normally refuse. In his research on influence, he identified a principle he called reciprocity. When someone gives you something, even something small like attention or a compliment or a free meal, you feel an almost involuntary pull to give something back. Cults did not invent this instinct. They simply learned to weaponize it earlier and more precisely than almost any other institution. The first thing you give back is usually small. A little more time, a little more information about your life, a promise to come to one more gathering. None of it feels like a commitment. Each step is designed not to feel like one. This is where the second mechanism enters, and it is arguably the most powerful one in the entire process. Cialdini also described something called commitment and consistency. Once you take a small action, your brain works hard to justify that action as reasonable, because humans are deeply uncomfortable holding two contradictory beliefs about themselves. If you attended one meeting, you must be the kind of person who attends meetings like this. If you agreed with one idea, you must be the kind of person open to ideas like that one. Each tiny yes reshapes your self-image just slightly, and each new self-image makes the next yes easier. You are not being tricked into a single terrible decision. You are being walked, one small comfortable step at a time, away from where you started. By the time anything resembling real ideology appears, you may have already changed who you believe yourself to be. This slow architecture explains something that confuses most outsiders. Why don't people just leave once things get strange? The honest answer is that very few cults introduce the strange parts on day one. They introduce them gradually, wrapped in language you've already learned to trust from people who have already proven repeatedly that they care about you. There is a name for the broader system this builds toward. Stephen Hassan, a former cult member turned researcher, developed what he calls the BITE model, an acronym describing 4 types of control a group can exert over a person: behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control. Behavior control might look like a rigid daily schedule that leaves no time for outside relationships. Information control might mean discouraging or forbidding contact with former friends, family, or unapproved news sources. Thought control often involves loaded language, phrases with meanings only insiders understand, which quietly replace a person's own vocabulary for describing their experience. Emotional control usually centers on guilt, fear, and the constant threat, spoken or implied, that leaving means losing everything, including the people you've come to love inside the group. None of these 4 elements needs to arrive all at once. In fact, they almost never do. They accumulate the way sediment accumulates, invisible day to day, undeniable only in hindsight. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Once someone is fully inside this system, evidence against the group's beliefs does not usually produce doubt. It often produces the opposite. In 1954, a psychologist named Leon Festinger infiltrated a small doomsday group that believed the world would end on a specific date, and that believers would be rescued by a flying saucer before the destruction began. Festinger wanted to see what would happen when the prophecy failed. The date arrived. Nothing happened. No flood. No saucer. You might expect the group to collapse in embarrassment. Instead, many members became more convinced than ever. The leader announced that the group's faith had been so powerful it had single-handedly saved the entire planet from destruction. Rather than abandoning their beliefs, members began recruiting even more aggressively than before. Festinger called this cognitive dissonance. When a deeply held belief is contradicted by reality, and the psychological cost of admitting you were wrong feels too enormous to bear, the mind often chooses a stranger path. It does not abandon the belief. It reinterprets the evidence to protect it. This single mechanism explains why rational argument so rarely works on someone deep inside a high-control group. You are not simply disagreeing with a claim they hold. You are asking them to admit that months or years of their life, their relationships, their sacrifices, their entire identity, were built on something false. For most human minds, that admission is more painful than almost anything else. So the mind protects itself instead, sometimes by digging in harder. This is also why isolation is such a central tool across nearly every high-control group in history. It is not simply about controlling information. It is about removing every voice that might reflect an old version of you back at yourself. Without a mirror, it becomes far easier to forget what you used to look like. Step back for a moment from cults specifically and look at the shape of what's actually happening. A person going through a vulnerable transition receives intense attention. Small commitments accumulate into a new identity. Outside relationships fade. Information narrows. And when reality contradicts the belief system, the mind defends the belief rather than question it. None of these mechanisms are exotic. Every one of them exists in smaller doses in ordinary life. You have felt the pull of a group that made you feel unusually special. You have justified a decision after the fact because reversing it felt like admitting a mistake. You have avoided information that threatened something you didn't want to lose. The tools cults use are not alien to human psychology. They are simply dialed up, deployed deliberately, and aimed at your most vulnerable moments instead of your most stable ones. This is why cult researchers increasingly resist the word brainwashing. That word implies something mystical, almost supernatural, an erasure of the self that couldn't happen to someone paying attention. The reality is far more mundane and far more disturbing. It is not magic. It is a set of well-understood psychological principles, applied patiently, by people who have often refined the process across years of practice on other vulnerable strangers. Understanding this doesn't just explain how cults form. It explains why so many other institutions borrow the same architecture without ever calling themselves a cult at all. Multi-level marketing schemes rely on love bombing and consistency spirals. Extremist online communities rely on information control and loaded language. Even certain workplaces build cultures around isolation from outside relationships and the implied threat that leaving means losing everything you've built. The tactics are rarely confined to compounds and robes. They surface anywhere a group benefits from your total, uninterrupted loyalty. So what actually protects someone from this? The research offers an answer that is almost frustratingly simple: maintained outside relationships. Not suspicion, not cynicism, not distance from every new idea, but a stubborn, ongoing connection to people who knew you before, who can gently reflect back the person you used to be, and who are allowed to ask uncomfortable questions without being treated as the enemy. That single thread, kept intact, is often the difference between a person who can walk away and a person who cannot imagine walking away at all. Think back to that overly kind stranger from the beginning, the one who remembered your birthday, the one who seemed to understand you instantly. None of that warmth on its own is evidence of anything sinister. Genuine connection exists everywhere, and most people who are kind to you are simply being kind. The difference isn't in how the first conversation feels. The difference is in what comes next. Does the warmth stay conditional on your continued involvement? Does it grow the moment you mention old friends, or push back on an idea, or ask for space? Watch what happens not when you say yes, but the very first time you say no. Someone is being kind to you right now. Too kind. Pay attention to what happens the moment you stop agreeing.